So Robbie, your name came up in the metadata analysis of Cameron Kakemo's complaint against Liam Carrigan during the recent board election. Can you explain your name in the metadata?
Yep. So Cameron Kakemo came to me for advice on that particular complaint the day after the results were called. And basically I sat with him at Palmer and had coffee, heard his story, heard what he thought about filing a complaint, and I went in my laptop to look at the regulations and to look at the Constitution and to see if he actually had a case. He then copied and pasted the regulations into a Word document. So that's where my name started in the metadata, because when you create a document, that's the first instance of the name of hearing. He then sent that document on to himself for him to follow through with it. That's when my involvement actually ended. I went about my day. I went to Board Weekly, I went to Due Review, and I was in Due Review when the complaint was filed. When I gave the advice to Cameron, I gave it as the board director elected to sit on electoral committee, and I didn't give it in any way that could be deemed as me putting a judgment call on Liam. I can say this now, I don't think that what Cameron put forward had any merit. It obviously didn't, the RO threw it out, but I would give that advice and assistance to any person who wanted to look into the regulations and call anyone into account, because I believe in accountability and transparency in these matters.
Do you think if other board directors didn't know that was your reason or misinterpreted your involvement, it would affect your ability to work on board?
I think there's definitely a possibility of that, but I've spoken to all the people that I work with on board that had a particular issue with that, and they are understanding of the circumstances. I've spoken to both Liam and Tara specifically about this, and both of them seem fine with the situation. As far as I can understand.
No worries. Do you think it will affect the executive election coming up?
I don't think it will. I think the executive election ultimately comes down to who individuals believe is the best person for the job. Sure, this could be niggling in the back of individuals' minds, but if this is the one thing that I have done wrong, then I think that person is making a judgment call that is unfair. And I think they're ignoring all the other good things that I have done, all the good things I have fought for, and all the good things that I will continue to fight for if I am elected as president.
Okay, so saying that you're running for president?
Yes.
Will you be seeking Senate-appointed votes in your run?
No.
Okay, good. So, on a slightly more positive note, what do you see the role as the president being?
Yep. So I see this next president having two kind of roles. Dealing with the day-to-day stuff of what the president is expected to do. So I brought my proposal for you guys to look at. I would need to take it back because I haven't actually finished it as a draft copy. But I see the president having the role of doing SAF negotiations, doing looking toward the new CEO contract, that kind of expected presidential role. But I see the next president also dealing with the issues of the past and ensuring they don't happen again. Issues like censuring of directors, particular directors going after other directors, the CEO potentially going against the will of the board, and other members of the board being complicit in that. I see the role of the president being the mediator between the staff and the board, a happy medium between the two. The way that I see me fitting into that specifically is I see myself as some parts of the executive that I wish to serve on, but also to some parts of the board that will be serving from 2014 to 2015. So that's why I'm nominating for that role.
I see. So how would you characterise yourself differently from Hannah's presidency the most, do you think?
Yep. It's all hypothetical because I haven't been elected. I haven't experienced what she has experienced. I also hope that I don't experience what she has experienced. But I would see myself as a more willing participant in consultation with the board, but also with the membership. I think that's the one thing that her presidency ultimately comes down to, is that she has failed to consult with the board on multiple issues. And when she has consulted on the board, it has been half-hearted attempts at consultation, which is inappropriate, given that she is the sole voice of the board, other than the CEO. So that would be the main difference, but also consulting with the members in a meaningful way, and actually going out of my way to consult with them. I know she has consultation hours, but I don't believe those have been used for her to consult with members specifically.
Okay, so on that, do you think that if, I guess Rowie is the elephant in the room, if there was something like that where there was quite a strong vocal outcry from the majority of the students, but it was something that you stood against. Would you be swayed by the membership's view, or would you sort of hold your own on it?
It depends on the circumstance, but I would say 9 times out of 10 I would be swayed by the views of the membership. We exist to serve the membership, and I believe that their views matter more than the views of an individual.
Okay. So specifically, again, on Tom, of course, when you voted to keep Tom, Cade criticised your position in part for being a bit of a political or a presidential push. Can you sort of clarify that for us now and why there was that change of heart?
Yep. So from the moment that the Tom motion came forward, I was never going to vote to remove him. At best, in the situation, for those who wished to remove him, I was going to vote to abstain, because I did not feel that what he had done warranted removal. I also didn't feel like I had all the information readily available for that decision to be made either. I also disagreed with the previous censure. If I was on board at the time when he was censured for speaking out against life choice and expressing concerns with Interfaith Week, I wouldn't have voted in favour of that. So I think that's what informed that initial decision. I supported, loosely supported, the union going to court, but more because we were taken to court, and it was framed in a way that we were seeking clarification on whether we had the ability to remove a director in a certain circumstance. And when it was framed to us, it was framed as, what about the circumstance where someone steals money from the union? Do you want to know that you'll be able to remove that person? And of course my answer was yes. So that's why I went and supported that legal action. When I changed my vote, it was around the time of when the judgment was called, and there were words thrown around about the union being undemocratic, and there was also a campaign, the Stand With Robby campaign, and all of this was floating around, and I could no longer justify abstaining from something that I abhorrently was against. And so I voted to keep Tom, and I don't regret that. In regards to Cade's comments, I find it kind of interesting that he doesn't justify his actions as also being a potential play for executive, when if the Senate appointed directors were to vote, presumably they would have voted for someone who chose to remove Tom.
Okay, yeah, so that was going to lead me into the other question, which is, to the best of your knowledge, why do you think the board or the exec wanted to get rid of Tom?
I think they viewed what he did in leaking a sentence from a document as a breach of his duties. I see it differently. I think it was exactly within his duties. The first couple of clauses in our constitution are about the members and about being accountable to them and our fiduciary duty to them. I think it was basically their reading of the constitution and the regulations more than anything, which is problematic because whilst they're in black and white, it is a very subjective document. You can read multiple, you can make multiple inferences from that document. Okay,
so when some of us spoke to Tim, the reason he gave for board directors sometimes voting against the interests of the students was to say that board directors or executive members have access to facts that the average student doesn't have access to. How legitimate do you think that is as a defence?
I think there is some legitimacy in it. Like, yes, we do have more facts than the average member, but it depends on the circumstance. So I think one example of where a board director has gone against what the membership ultimately would want would be Tom, when in choosing the new coffee tender for the union, he went against full fair trade and went for Rainforest Alliance. He still, I think, believed he voted against it, but he knew that that was in the benefit of the union itself, not in necessarily the interests of the members that he represented. I think in that sort of circumstance, potentially that's the 1 out of the 10 that I would vote against what the membership are ultimately saying. But I think it would be, I don't get that argument, to be honest. Like, I don't think there's a circumstance where the members don't know what they want and where the board shouldn't be representing that.
Okay, cool. And I'll promise I'll pull you out of discussion about Tom pretty quickly.
It's okay.
But of course, at the meeting to expel Tom, you offered part of your stipend to pay up a cost. Have you had any more word on what those costs are? We know, of course, they didn't come out of the AGM.
Yeah.
And is that offer still on the table?
Yeah. So full costs haven't even been given to the board yet, unless it's been given to individuals. I haven't seen the full cost statement. But if there was a circumstance where the union was seeking Tom to pay the financial costs of our legal representation, then yes, I would put my full stipend forward.
Perfect. A lot of the, sorry, this is the last kind of Tom really related question.
Okay.
A lot of the discussion
Expected.
about Tom was used as a discussion of staff versus students.
Mm-hmm.
As a president or a director, to whom is a greater duty owed?
Between
Staff
students.
and students.
Definitely to the students. I think those aren't mutually exclusive though. In recent months, particularly after the Tom situation, the staff have kind of developed a new understanding of what this board is after and why we are saying the things we are saying. Particular staff members have been more accommodating with the things that we want to do. The perfect example is the marketing department putting forward that they wanted to promote the NDA and the rally that was happening on campus, which was shocking because they've never wanted to do it before, but they have kind of developed a new understanding of what their roles are, and they're trying to conform to this kind of progressive left-leaning movement that the union is going down. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but if I was in a circumstance where it was an us versus them kind of situation, I would always pick students.
Okay. And what is your working relationship like with the staff at the moment?
Yep, I have a really positive working relationship with most of the staff. Particularly the head of marketing, head of programs, and the head of facilities. I've dealt with them specifically throughout the career review that I conducted, the gender neutral bathrooms concern and the NDA as well. So those three are ones that I have really positive working relationships with. That's not to say I don't have positive working relationships with others. It's just that those are the three that I would turn to if I had something that I wanted to do.
And of course, the union are contracting a new CEO this year. I see that it's in your
Yes.
proposal. Who do you think is best suited for the role at the moment, and what type of person is best?
Yep. I think it would be really remiss of me to declare my individual opinion on the CEO and who it should be. Ultimately, it's a board decision. I have my own particular views on what kind of CEO we should have. Andrew Woodward has been a great CEO in the capacity of looking towards financial sustainability, ensuring that a union can work in the interests of the members. However, when he is constantly focused on the strategic plan, he has missed out two very important and the most important lines in the strategic plan: relevance and community. So whoever the next CEO is, be it Andrew Woodward, be it someone within the organisation, be it potentially someone from the not-for-profit sector, be it we seek a external consultant to find the next CEO, they need to ensure, well, the board needs to ensure that the next person is able to tick off relevance and community and not just financial sustainability, particularly now that we have a director of finance who is able to report to the board, and we are in a much more secure financial position than we were in years past.
Do you think those differences that, like, you as a board director focus more on community where Andrew focuses on finance, do you think that's one of the biggest tensions between staff and students, or do you see other major tensions between staff and students at the moment?
I don't think it's necessarily a tension. I think we're coming from different places. The board has a desire to support things that are in the activist advocacy space, for example, queer issues, women issues, ethnocultural issues. Andrew wants to see the financial sustainability of the organisation. He sees those as exclusive, that you can't do both. I see that you can do both, particularly given that a lot of what we have done in those particular areas with particularly marginalised groups has not been throwing money at it. I think one of the issues that has come about is that the staff have a misunderstanding of what we are trying to do. They think it's strictly activism, that we're trying to tread on the toes of the SRC and that we're trying to run campaigns that are not within the remit of the union. But when in actual fact what we're trying to do is demonstrate that those issues are important to members within the union, those issues are things that we should be supporting, and that they aren't necessarily activists, they're advocacy. We are a union of students and we should be advocating for the welfare of all students, and these are students whose welfare are particularly important.
Okay. Sorry. Do you mind if I very quickly jump in?
Yeah.
So, are you able to say clearly for us now whether or not you'd be supporting reappointing Andrew?
At this stage, I would not support the reappointment of Andrew, but that's my own individual opinion. My opinion is 1 out of 11 or 13, depending on how many directors vote and whether the Senate-appointed directors will be voting on this matter. But that's not to say that my mind might potentially change. At this stage, I want to see the next CEO as someone that is working in the interests of the board, representing the views of the board, which is the two major things that the CEO should be doing, and that is something that's been lacking with Andrew Woodward.
Okay. Cheers.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, I lost your spot.
That's okay. Oh, here you go. Yes. So, transparency is one of the big buzzwords around the campaign and huge in the union at the moment. Would you support any formalised steps to increase transparency, and if so, what steps would those be?
Yep. Well, I've included specific instances of transparency that I want to support. Things like board minutes going up the second the board meeting has finished. Things like all board papers to do with directors, particularly being put up before the board meeting, particularly because we should be accountable to the students that elected us. Things like working parties being more transparent and having reports from the board about what happens in these working parties. There's a lot of misinformation that is surrounding these working parties. It's a lot of people think that we sit in a dark room and then we decide, oh, this is what we're going to market this week, but we're not going to market this because fuck students, which is not the case. The work that we do in that is ultimately stuff that we should be reporting to the board. It's just there has been a lack of the will from certain individuals to do that, and that's why there's a lack of transparency around it. So they're particular instances that I would support, but I've listed others there as well if you wanted to ask questions on those.
Well, do you want to kind of outline the main things you've mentioned very briefly?
Well, so the main things would be
yes,
ensuring that we put board minutes up, board director reports, particularly from the executive, that working parties are looked into of how we can report on those more efficiently. I would also like to see our staff tweeted. I know there is one head of department who is in particular interest of has particular issues with being tweeted, and then there's another head of department who is pro being tweeted. So it's just a matter of determining who can, what times can be tweeted, and if there's any sensitive issues around that.
No worries. How open do you think the board weekly meeting should be?
I think a lot of what is discussed at the board weekly meetings is relevant to students, but again, it's one of those situations where we should be reporting on that. It doesn't necessarily need to be minuted, doesn't necessarily need to be publicly held. A lot of what happens at Board Weekly is bonding and banter between the board and discussion over what we have done over our past week. Often the agenda is very thin because we meet so frequently. And so I don't necessarily think that's the biggest concern that members should be having when it comes to board transparency or union transparency.
Well, obviously that you don't tell your members everything at the moment. What is it specifically that the board should be able to talk about without union members knowing, or do you want to move to union members knowing everything in full transparency?
Any concern, anything that relates to the membership, the members should be able to know. The only concern that I have is when it comes to HR. The specific concern is when it comes to HR matters, and that is why those matters are discussed in camera. I think it would be very remiss of the board to discuss those matters ex camera, and so I would not support that in any instance.
Yeah. You said there was banter in your weekly meetings, and I'm sure you see each other outside of the office. How often do you think the board makes decisions on things outside of formal meetings, even if that's between two people?
Yep. We informally make decisions at Board Weekly, but they always go to working parties, and then there's a formal, so there's a process, my favourite buzzword. It starts at Board Weekly, goes to weekly meetings, goes to the executive, then goes to board. That's how our process works at the moment. So I think if there's reports coming from weekly, executive and board to the members, then that's the greatest way to ensure transparency. No decisions are concretely made at weekly. There are no formal resolutions passed at weekly. The greatest decision that we probably make is that we're going to look into something, and that's when it goes to a working party.
So you don't think any decisions are made outside?
Oh, there are other decisions that are made through circular resolution. I have a lot of concerns around circular resolution, particularly given that an example of good governance would be that if someone votes against a circular resolution or abstains, it would then go to the board meeting. That has been a failure of this board in particular. There have been particular instances where circular resolutions should have failed and haven't. They've gone through because a majority has voted for them. I think there needs to be, and this is something that the board has discussed, developing a circular resolution policy, a lot of policies, and ensuring that whatever circulars are put forward are things to do with student leadership positions, not necessarily things that, and HR-based decisions, not necessarily things that relate to the membership as a whole.
So do you think discussions and decisions made between board members outside of the meeting have much influence on the decision-making process at all at the moment?
I would say there's definitely an element of that, but I don't discuss board matters with anyone outside of working parties. I don't discuss it outside of board meetings, so I can't speak on that necessarily.
Okay. What is your opinion of moving in camera during meetings, and would you take steps to eradicate it to increase transparency?
We now have an in-camera policy, and I think this is a fantastic step for the board, and I'm surprised it took so long to get a policy on this, given the concerns around transparency and given that we were potentially acting in a way that was going against our meeting procedure. But I would not move towards a step to remove it. I think it's important to have that in place for when we are discussing sensitive HR matters that can only be reported monthly. So I wouldn't move to eradicate it, but I think that policy should be frequently updated. I think it should also be publicly made available to the membership. Hannah, in the last couple of meetings, has quoted Article 2.2 point whatever, and no one knows what that is. That is another example of how the board is not acting transparently when it's not going to act transparently. And so I think that's probably going to alleviate some concerns of the membership, because at a base level, if they are presented with the in-camera policy and they can see that a particular article relates to the hiring of a particular individual, they know what the matter is, and then they can understand why we are not discussing it publicly.
So on sort of a different level, there's been a lot of criticism of this current board and the past ones as sort of being governed at times by cliques or by social impact. I mean, have you felt that's the case with your time on board?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that I felt even before I ran for board, and it's one of the reasons why I ran for board. When I first got involved in the union, there was this very strong mentality that you had to be in the know, in the clique. It was very dynastical and structured. And those who got elected to board generally came from a very similar group, very similar background. And then when they got elected to board, they would kind of isolate individuals on that board. The perfect example is Viv Moxham Hall, a really good friend of mine, who throughout her entire time on board felt like everything that she was saying was ignored because she wasn't part of the dominant force on board. So I ran for board knowing that I was not part of this dominant force. I once was friends with those people who were part of that dominant force, and I was rejected because I would not conform to what their views were on certain things, that I had different opinions on what the union should be doing. Potentially they also just didn't like me, I don't know. So yes, those cliques do exist. They exist pre-election to board, and then they exist when you're on board. The perfect example was for the board when we had our induction, where half the board would go one way and the other half of the board would go the other. There was this creation of an us versus them mentality from day one. There has been attempts to kind of, fix that, and there have been examples of individuals, almost changing sides. But there is that tendency for a clique to develop, and so I would say that in many circumstances that clique does inform the decisions that individuals make.
Okay, and can you see yourself as president trying to do something to stop that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first brilliant thing that has happened is that for the first time in my memory, the people elected to board are not from a dominant independent clique of friends for friends' sake, which I think is fantastic. And even the independent that was elected is willing to work with people who are not part of that dominant culture of friendship and like the tyrannical, dynastical vision of what the union is. So I think step one already covered. I think step two would be having an executive that is led by people who have not come from that previously dominant view, and who are willing to work with people regardless of what their background is or who their friends are, but work in the interests of the membership, because that's what it is about. It's not about your friends, solely your friendship circle. It's about a wider net of people.
Okay, I see. But of course you come from a faction as well. I mean, to what extent do you think that would or does inform your position on board?
I don't think it informs it at all. Yes, I am part of a faction, but I can look back at the minutes that have, and so I'm going to use an example of John Harding-Eason here. I can look back at the minutes of the board and the decisions that I have made, and again, 9 times out of 10, I've disagreed with John. So my factional influence has no bearing on anything that I do on board.
Okay, so that's it. Is there anyone who you feel particularly politically or personally close to on board currently?
Yeah, Baby D'Souza.
Okay, I see. So in that case, do you think that in general elections that the board has, but particularly the executive election, should be something that should be conducted by secret ballot?
I can see the merits in secret ballot. I can also see the merits in a public ballot. I can also see the merits in a direct election. I think ultimately the reason for the secret ballot is that it is in the regulations that it must be conducted by secret ballot. I had not actually considered it until the other day, until people were discussing it online, being like, why is this the case? I think there's definitely merit in looking into that. Potentially not now, because we are beholden to the regulations, and the cutoff date for regulation changes was the board meeting just passed. So a bit awkward timing, but I think that's definitely something that should be looked into for the following year. I know I personally had an issue with the Tom decision being made in secret ballot, and there was a lot of discussion around that. So I would also take the similar tact that if the membership are interested in knowing how particular individuals vote in executive elections, then the board should respond to that and hold public ballot so that the members can see and keep their directors to account.
Okay, very good. However, of course, on a far more negative note, the frozen yogurt trend, of course, has died over the last few years since you ran on it as one of your platforms. So how realistic is the Froyo dream on campus?
It's actually going into the Laneway Cafe.
Oh,
so
really?
It's happening.
I see. Well, then...
This is just based on the reports that I've received from staff. So
still, and our scoop.
Yeah.
So, I mean, would you call that your biggest achievement on board?
God, no.
No?
God, I had no work to do for that. It just happened.
Okay.
It was really good, though. No, I think my greatest achievement on board and something that I am most proud of is the queer review that I conducted. It wasn't something that I ran on as a policy, so to speak. I ran on a very badly termed policy of Rainbow Robby, which was to have a rainbow crossing on Eastern Avenue. I don't know why I had that, to be honest. I think it was basically me trying to say I am a queer identifying individual, so there will be elements of what I do relating to that, but I didn't want to run as the queer identifying individual. I didn't want it to be boxed in solely that particular area. But of course, when I got on board, that has probably been what my main focus has been, because it's been a massive lack of focus for the union, particularly given the last queer portfolio holders did nothing.
Okay. So, I mean, you've kind of touched on it already, that a lot of your promises have morphed a bit from what you actually ran on. Do you have any particular reasons why you think that's happened?
Yeah, definitely. My conception of what the union has developed through my time on board, through discussions that I've had with people like Baby, Tom, Eve. That's probably informed a lot of why my policies have kind of not been the main focus of my time on board. But that's not to say that my policies haven't also been a focus. I have a checklist of policies. I ran on 20 and I've implemented at least 15 of them, which I think is a positive thing. I don't know if anyone else can make a claim like that. I'm happy to provide that list to you if you would like. I don't have it here with me. I should have thought of that. But once I had ticked off the policies that I ran on, I chose a different tact of what I would do on board, because a lot of the structure around elections comes down to your popularity. It comes down to what you can offer to students. I think those policies are important because it shows what kind of things you would focus on, but it doesn't necessarily say those are the things that you're going to implement. When I would campaign to people, I wouldn't say, oh, I'm going to get a Froyo place on campus and that's all I'm going to do. And if I am told that I can't do that, well, I'm going to fight for Froyo. No, it was, I want to see that space utilised in Wentworth Building and not just be empty for the sake of empty, like just sitting there being useless. That was the point behind the policy, and Froyo was an idea for that space. It wasn't necessarily that Froyo was the only option.
Okay, so when board directors are out and making us promises on campus, we should take them with a grain of salt, or do you think it's their responsibility to sort of temper it to the populace?
I think it's their responsibility to define what they mean by their policies. Sorry, I'm feeling a bit, my chest is, I've got a chest infection, I apologise. So I think it's up to them to define their policies and explain what the intent behind each policy is. But Mostly because I think the membership will see, or students will see a policy like Froyo and be like, oh yeah, that's so exciting. And they may not read into it any further because they think an election promise is an election promise. It doesn't have any ifs or buts. There's no work to be involved. It's just once this person's elected, then the organisation will move in that direction. I think it's up to the candidates that are running to inform what the process of getting a policy is, and so that they can make a more informed decision rather than just be like, oh yeah, cool, I vote for this person, I get this. Yeah.
I see. So, I mean, on that basis, do you expect the new directors on board to sort of have a similar change in policies as they move along, or sort of adapt to things?
Yeah, definitely. I think when you get elected to board, you are presented with new information, you are presented with an induction and training, and one of the first things that the CEO says to you is if your policy doesn't fit within the strategic plan, then don't bother, which is very disheartening to hear. There is a finite number of resources, but I think it will be different with this cohort than in previous years because their promises have not just been things like new programs, new events, new outlets, Thai on campus, a bakery or a bar where there already is a bar. This year it's promises that are to do with accountability, transparency, environmental sustainability, social issues, not just fun and polished USU-esque events and parties. There are actually serious concerns within the membership, and each of the people who got elected and who ran as well, except for one candidate, Callum Forbes, ran on policies that were broader than ever before. And so I think it will be a different circumstance, but of course their mindsets will change, their political opinions will change, their views of what the organisation will change as well. And I think that's a good thing, and I think that's something that should be communicated to students when they are voting in these elections, because they expect the policies to be implemented and they often hold people accountable to it, but they don't know that people will change. They don't know that the mindset of the board is like ultimately your one vote. That's not ever explained. And I think there's also an onus on the union to better explain that. They run this as a program to inform members of what the union does, yet they don't tell people what the board does and what each of those people will be doing for a 2-year term. They don't mention anything about the executive elections and that after the first year on board, one of these people could be your president. They don't mention that each of these people have a vote that is often tied to political allegiances or tied to some other decision. So I think, like, obviously the candidates have a responsibility, but the union does as well. And I think it's a very untransparent election and a very untransparent program.
Do you think the president specifically has a duty to do that?
Yeah, definitely. I think the president and all the members on the electoral committee it's the onus is on them. It's something that I tried to change on electoral committee. One of the biggest issues, though, is that you are one voice. You have to have the will of the board, and if you don't have the will of the board, then your voice is irrelevant almost. So hopefully the circumstance arises where the right people who want to see these elections and want to see these campaign promises and their directors being accountable are elected to the executive, are the people who are in positions of authority, so to speak, are able to make the changes that are needed for this to happen.
Okay, and sort of again as how you could affect this stuff as president, obviously you've talked a bit about it being reasonable for people to shift their promises over time. Do you see yourself individually or see yourself as a potential president helping people shift their policies to change them, or do you think it's something that should be left to individuals to do?
I think there is a responsibility of second-year directors, not just the president, to discuss policies with each individual newly elected board director and help them understand what is possible, what isn't possible, but also what are the ways to make something possible. Nothing is impossible. Like a free breakfast bar, for example, yeah, the union could definitely run a free breakfast bar, but in what form? Would it be every day, or would it be just in exam times, or would it be just 1 week in the year, or would it be every Wednesday? What is the structure of that? They are the discussions that should be had with second-year board directors, not just specifically the president. But I think leaving the onus solely onto those people when they get elected to board is really problematic, given that they don't have the institutional knowledge of how the board works. That was something that I felt when I got elected to board. When this us versus them culture was created, I had to do all the groundwork to work out how to make any change within the organisation on my own. And I didn't have a president to support me. I didn't necessarily even have an executive member to support me. I had myself. And So I think there is a responsibility of the executive to ensure that people can actually do the things they promise and understand how to make them happen.
Finally, on a more outward-facing role, Tim Matthews, who is also running for president, spoke a lot about his experience in the SRC in his ONI interview. How do you see yourself approaching the relationship with other student organisations?
Yeah. I've detailed, again, this in my proposal, particularly in relation to staff negotiations, but also in developing other relationships with organisations like the SRC and Supra. There's been a lot of concern, as I mentioned, between staff that the union is moving towards an SRC-esque role. I don't see it as that. I see it as the union and the board wanting to help the SRC and Supra do the things that they try to do with the finite budget that they have. We're an organisation that runs on a $22 million pool of funds, and yet we don't do anything with these student organisations. We expect them to pay for O-week stalls. We expect them to take a bigger cut in staff negotiations, yet they often do things that are more important to the general welfare of students, which I think is ludicrous given the first constitutional objective within the union is to ensure the welfare of students. And I think it's the most important thing in our constitution. So the tact that I would take when it comes to things like staff negotiations is that I would want to work with the SRC president and the president of Supra to ensure that they get what they need to function. But if we take a higher amount, that we are doing things like providing free O-week stalls, providing subsidised food and venue hire for the events that they run. I remember last year the Women's Collective ran an event called NITES, and they simply forgot to put the USU logo on something, so the union hunted them down for the funds. And I think that's ridiculous. Like, ultimately it was still held in a union space, and the union was still given, you know, credibility because they helped, but they still expected them to pay, which I think is ridiculous, for a $400, whatever it was, thing of pizza. I think there is more that the union can be doing to assist these student organisations to ensure that they can focus on the stuff that they need to focus on, not on the stuff that we should be focusing on. Another prime example is with the Rohingya Society this week, just gone, running Reconciliation Week, and the SRC putting all their funds into running this, yet it's a society from the University of Sydney Union that is running the events, and that's just ludicrous. Like, we should be taking that responsibility, not the SRC. So that's the tact that I would take when it comes to those two student organisations, ensuring that we work together, develop a memorandum of understanding, actually a formalised memorandum of understanding. I know previous presidents have promised that. It's something that I am strongly passionate about. I wanted to do it the second I got elected to board. And I was told by Hannah Morris that it was something that she would do. She's never done it. I have a problem with that, but that's another issue. So that's the tact I would take with those student organisations. When it comes to SUSF, I think a different tact is required. I would agree with the sentiments of directors like Tom and Bibi that we should be calling them out for the mistakes that they make and for their lack of transparency, for the lack of representation that they have. The perfect example is Student Consultative Committee, where they bring their CEO and their highest ranked people, but they don't bring the two elected vice presidents along to those discussions, and it's a student consultative committee. I think that's incredibly inappropriate. I think it's inappropriate that they receive a higher pool of staff yet do a less amount of things for students. I think it's inappropriate that no other student organisation is willing to call them out. I think that's largely to do with the fact that we are all involved in these negotiations and we don't necessarily want to lose out on potential extra funds, but I think there's definitely a need for that to happen moving forward. So that would also be something that I would want to work on with SRC and Supra.
And Tim said specifically on that his understanding of student interests as a whole was one that included a relationship with staff. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I definitely think we need to have a relationship with staff. It needs to be a positive working relationship. I am very pro the worker. I understand that the staff do care about the interests of students, but I think they have a very limited understanding of what the interests of students are at the moment. I don't think they have necessarily come to, like it took Andrew, for example, a long time to come to the understanding that students really do care about transparent governance. And that seems really odd because students have been saying it for years, yet it took a transparency forum where members were saying these things publicly for someone to understand that it is actually the case. It is a widespread concern. I am concerned that that actually has to happen, but I think developing a working relationship with staff is definitely important, but also developing their understanding of what the student organisation should be and could be is even more important.
Okay, too easy. I think that's
Yeah,
everything.
that's everything.
Beautiful.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.